is like, this is a combination. Well, first of all, this is a little outside of, but not completely outside of what I normally do. I normally do like 20th century type history, but recently I've been working on some stuff on the history wars. And so tonight what I'm doing is kind of combining some of my research areas with some of the stuff I've been teaching, and hopefully we can get a good conversation out of it. So what I kind of thought I would do is I was thinking about George Washington, and I was thinking about him in the context of the here and the now, right? But I think it's a fair statement to say that our politics are not particularly healthy at this moment. I would say probably the defining feature of our politics is often culture wars. And then there becomes this ongoing discussion of how do you create unity in a divided nation. And that's kind of got what we're thinking. And also thinking about the fact that this isn't the first time we've been a particularly divided nation. I know over the past few years, I've repeatedly pointed out that we had a civil war in the middle of the 19th century. So we have not yet done that. So what I thought I'd do is talk some about George Washington, some about how we think about history, we use history. Because one of the refrains we hear a lot is that the reason we're so divided is that we've lost the national narrative, right? How many of you heard that? Like just the idea that we no longer have a common story we tell ourselves, and that's the reason we can't get along. I'm not particularly sure I agree with that, but that is out there a lot. That discussion has been going on for a long time. So I thought what I would do is start with an observation Chris made in his first talk on John Adams. You may recall one of the things he talked about was that John Adams lost history. Probably true. Could be a variety of reasons for that. And Chris went over a lot of them. So what we want to think about is like, what the question is, how do you win history? Like, anybody got some thoughts on that? How we go about winning history? It's kind of a weird question, isn't it? Yeah, how do you win history? All right, so who keeps the score? Is it people like me? Like, what would be my claim to having decided who wins history and who doesn't? Come on, we're not in class. You can talk to me.
Everyone read your book and was
That was it. I don't sell that many copies, so I lack that influence. So, but that would be part of it, right? Like, part of it is the argument would be that as a person who teaches history, as a history professor, I'm a gatekeeper, right? Isn't that part of the argument? Yeah, like that goes on all the time. So the other question is there a leaderboard? Like, that just seems like a really silly question, doesn't it? Do we have a historical leaderboard? Well, actually, with presidents, we kind of do. Yeah, because we have this sort of weird, I don't know, I didn't say it's weird. I'll say it's weird, now it's recorded, it'll be on the internet. It's kind of this weird obsession with ranking our presidents, right? And you probably see this, it comes out periodically. I'm not going to go into detail tonight, but it's got like a long history itself. And it actually just goes back to 1948. Arthur Schlesinger Sr., not Arthur Schlesinger Jr., but Sr., who was a historian at Harvard, noticed he's a gatekeeper, called up some of his buddies at Ivy League schools and said, hey, I'd like to put out a magazine article, and why don't we just decide who were the best presidents? That's more or less what they did. It was wildly popular, and since then there's just been iteration after iteration about that. And then so we kind of do have a leaderboard for president, right? So incidentally, any of you know who normally gets ranked top three?
Washington, Lincoln, Rose FDR.
Yep, yeah, those are almost always the top three. Now there's all sort of different variations of this for political reasons, like conservative with an alternative list and with all other sorts of things. But those are the top three. Washington's almost top. What I was going to talk about tonight is other ways we kind of think about history. And I'm trying to separate out the different ways we think about history, right? Because I'm an academic, I have some very specific ways I think about history, but they're not necessarily ways the general public thinks about history. So one thing is that ranking system. I just called it weird. Why did I call it weird? How do we compare John Adams to Franklin Roosevelt? It's subjective, they're living in a completely different context. I don't know, I just think it's weird, right? So we got that. So that's the public loves these things, right? And they come out. So what I want to talk about is a little bit of this scholarship. Robert Valla, who wrote about American, this is the middle of the 20th century, wrote about American civil religion. And so this is a lot of this comes out of sociology. And the short version of this is that thing we talk about when we talk about wanting national unity. What's our civil religion, right? So this is when you talk about, you hear people talk about like the Declaration of Independence being our national creed, okay? So when we're having this discussion, what he means by civil religion are basically those things that bind us together. The rituals, the customs, the belief in a common narrative. That's what he's talking about. And usually he calls it civil religion because these rituals of our politics, these rituals of our community, often mimic religious ceremonies, right? So if you look at how people behave around a lot of these, I'm not saying they're religious in nature. What I'm saying is they mimic religious ceremonies as they create social bonds. The other one I wanted to talk about here, who had a big influence on me, was Gary Allen Payne, who's a sociologist, and he wrote about reputational entrepreneurs. And he was particularly interested in people who had what he called difficult reputations. So he went through and had a chapter about people whose reputation had gone into tanks. So kind of probably one you're all most familiar with, Benedict Arnold, right? And he wrote about reputational entrepreneurs, which I think is something that's kind of interesting to think about is this. If we're going to be talking about people's reputation, if we're going to be talking, especially once they're dead, although when you listen to, when Chris was talking about John Adams, they were talking about like mugging for history, right? And since they were Jefferson was his own reputational entrepreneur. He's like hanging on, I am not going to die until the 4th of July. Why does he do that? Because he has a sense of history. He wants to create his own legacy, right? But one of the things you'll see, and once you start thinking about this, you'll see this kind of everywhere. People go and they start shaping the reputations of those around them. So you'll see this, like when a president's leaving office, this will kick into gear. And this becomes these reputational entrepreneurs and these civil religion, and it creates this strong sense of community. It doesn't have to be around the nation state. It doesn't have to be around politics. It can be around a lot of things. So, question for you, how many of you are from the Buffalo area? So the way I say about this is, and I almost had this quote on the slide deck and I took it off, is this. If I say, where else would you rather be? What is the correct response? Right, that's a call and response, right? What you did before a Bills game. Now, those of you who aren't from the Buffalo area, did you just feel kind of alienated? Like, wait, there's an in crowd and an out crowd, and the in crowd knows the call and response, the out crowd doesn't, right? That's another kind of form of that. That's a ritual because it's, what is it grounded in? What moment history is that grounded in? Yeah, it's grounded in the 90s Bills team, right? When there's a whole narrative around it. So we can kind of see how this system works in kind of all aspects of our life, right? We see this like, so, and one of the things I've been thinking about is how like as we move online, this becomes more like almost like a form of influencer. Like I've been thinking a lot about how, because he wrote this really before the internet took off the way we know the internet today. And I just think this is, the internet is just like really taking this off, but we can come back to that. So in short, memory is kind of the social memory, it's the stories we tell ourselves. Those stories tend to be morality tales. They tend to sort of take off the rough edges. They take off a lot of the complex stuff because it exists to teach us a story, right? Or teach us how we should behave in our society. And it's a way. I think we're good. All right. It's a way to basically often pass on values, right? And a lot of times you tell these children, you tell them the family members, they show up a lot of different places. And another way we want to think about it is this is a way for people in the past to tell us what we should be thinking about the defined history for us, right? So when you think about what a monument does or a statue, what it does is it's a way of saying we should honor Abraham Lincoln. How do we know we should honor Abraham Lincoln? Oh, come on.
Put them on a coin.
We put him on a coin. Yeah, we do that. We put him on a coin. We build a big giant monument to him in Washington, D.C. That's what we do. And that was somebody in 1924 telling people, us, a century later, we need to honor Abraham Lincoln, right? So this process goes on quite a bit. And it differs from like academic history because we tend to emphasize context, complexity. In other words, we like to say when you ask you a question, it depends, and you have to put it in context. And we never, ever, ever give you a straightforward answer. There's always like, we always kind of like tell you how complicated it is. We're never like yes or no or whatever, right? So where does all this take place? And I'm getting to Washington here in a minute. It takes place in the public square, however we want to define that, right? So it can take place in politics. We see this all the time. So just off the top of your head, think about political movements. I don't care, left, right, whatever, major political party, that somehow or another take up the name of something from the American Revolution. Well, you might remember the Tea Party, right, back in the Obama years. Well, currently we got no King's protest. That's a direct reference to the American Revolution. Like this just goes on and on and on, right? Because that becomes like this touchstone. So we've also had a lot of discussion recently about statues. Because remember, statute is, if we put up a statue to something, what are we telling future people?
Honor its legacy.
Yeah, this is how we want you to interpret history, right? We see this in the monuments, we see this in museums. I would argue increasingly we see this online. I also think this goes on a lot in the classroom, right? So when we think about history education, civics education, fair amount of that is actually grounded in like, yes, we want you to know history, but it's also, this is one of the purposes it serves. It's actually one of the central tensions of history education. Are we supposed to teach you to be patriotic? Okay, that sounds good. What do we mean to be patriotic?
Your country, or what it's.
But that gets complicated quickly, doesn't it? Right? So we need to kind of keep all this in mind. And also remind ourselves, because now I'm pivoting to George Washington, that in some ways we almost have a parasocial relationship with him. So which of these guys is George Washington? Why do you say that? Which left? Your left or my left?
My left.
Okay. So you think this one's George Washington. Why am I showing you two pictures? Yeah, they're both him. So because, and this is stating it blindingly obvious, but sometimes it's good just to say it out loud. Do we know what George Washington actually looked like?
Not really, because there wasn't photography back then.
There was not photography. So we have a whole lot of paintings. So this one may have been painted by somebody sympathetic to the British. So this is kind of worth thinking about, right? So the point about it is that there is a fuzziness to the past, right? And I'm not saying, and at no point will I say there aren't historical facts. I am saying that sometimes those facts need to be put in context. Because remember, my job is to say it's complicated. So, how do we come up with the idea for the founding fathers? And I did this on purpose, just to kind of, after Chris's talk. So who's the dude in the middle? Yeah, so I centered him, so Chris can be happy. All right, so who's over here? The proper George Washington, our George Washington, right? Now, this is where it gets tricky. Who's this guy? Yep, it is Warren G. Harding. I know more about him than any human being alive should. I will forego talking about almost all of that. But I would be very happy if you can tell me when he was president.
1921 to 1923.
Ooh, I'm very happy right now. Do you know what killed him?
Some time that it was either a heart attack or
Congestive heart failure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Widely believed to have been murdered. So the reason I put him up there, actually, there's a couple reasons. He is often regarded as the worst president ever in U.S. history. So he has a difficult reputation. The man loved alliteration, right? And he loved to bloviate. Bloviate being the art of holding forth with lots of verbiage, not necessarily a lot of meaning. So, where do we get the term founding fathers? Because what I like to tell my students, they don't walk around in hats and hoodies saying, I'm a founding father, or ask me about it. They may have mugged for history, but they're not buying swag. Where do we get the term founding fathers? And there's a clue, and I put Harding up there. When do we start calling them the founding fathers? 1916, Republican National Convention, Senator from Ohio, Warren G. Harding, gives a speech, and the man loves alliteration. So he comes up with founding fathers. He uses it multiple times in that speech. 1920, he goes to win the presidential election. He talks about it a lot. And that's when we get the term. That's when we start saying we have the founding fathers. It comes out of this 1920-ish time period, right? Prior to this, if you went back to, I don't know, talk to Abraham Lincoln, and he said, what about the founding fathers? He would have been like, I don't know what you're talking about. So, Warren G. Harding gives us the phrase, the founding fathers. Oh, let's do it this way. Apparently it's frozen. All right, there we go. And we kind of continued that on to this day, right? So, how many of you watched the Ken Burns documentary, the one on the American Revolution? You got one sort of, kind of, nobody else? Anybody, so you weren't watching like the lead up to it? So Ken Burns, he puts out this massive documentary on the American Revolution, and in all the build up to it, because Ken Burns, he's a name, right? He's like super well known. So what he does is he's everywhere. And one of the things he's doing is he's talking about this documentary as a moment to restore the national narrative. So he's got a lot of pithy ways of saying this, but basically the one I kind of like was he's going to put the us back in U.S., right? So my personal opinion is asking a documentary to kind of heal the body politic. That's a big lift for one documentary on PBS. But we talked about this in the past, right? Yeah. So, but one of the things he did was he centered George Washington. And this is nothing new. This is how sort of the national identity in some ways was created, right? So he also was very much trying to go back to your earlier discussion. Is the revolution a top-up or bottom-down phenomenon? Ken Burns was trying to have both ways, right? He's trying to talk about this is a revolution that sort of percolates up from the bottom, but he also talks about George Washington as this indispensable man. Without Washington, we don't have a revolution. We don't have a country. Why would that be the case? Why would that one person be indispensable? Well, let me ask you a different question. how unusual is it for somebody like George Washington to lead a revolution? What's his position? What does he do? What's he do for a living?
He's a planter.
He's a plantation owner, which also means what?
He owns slaves.
He owns slaves. He owns, depending on several hundred. Yeah. I was gonna say it depends on which time period you're talking about, but there's a lot. He's got a very I've got this later in the slide deck. There's a very convoluted record on the issue of slavery, to say the least. What else did he do? So he's wealthy. He was an officer in the British Army. Oh, what are you gonna add? I can't hear you. He was a land surveyor, yeah, especially land speculator. So how many revolutions are there that's led by rich white guys? They just wake up in the morning and they're like, wow, I'm tired of being on top of society. I think I want to topple the old order. That just doesn't happen, does it? Like, can you think of any instance like, so the American Revolution is actually kind of unusual in that respect, right? Because if you think about it, you can go down the list, and there's certainly people like Thomas Payne who don't fit that bill, but there's a lot of them who did, like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, kind of the list goes on and on. So one of Washington's identities is that of like revolutionary, rebel, right? And so the kind of conventional wisdom of why does he do this, right? And it's going to be somewhat individual for all the others. But for Washington in particular, it's because when he's in the British Army, how long does that go for? He's also very much convinced, because he's a colonial, and he thinks of himself as British, but he thinks the British think of him as a second-class citizen. So he's sort of stepping on his pride, right? The planter class, this is very important. They spend a lot of time in debt. So they're living large. Jefferson's probably the best example of this. Jefferson dies, I don't know, he died beyond broke. It's like, whatever his financial situation was, it was like really horrible. And so same thing happens in Madison. Washington, although a very wealthy man, his fortunes go up and down. Because if you think about running a plantation and agriculture, it's kind of an unstable business, like one bad crop. Slavery as an economic institution is in some ways backwards looking, like even as by the time we get to this point, we're on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. So Washington is among those who constantly, even though he is wealthy, he is always leveraged. The fear is they're like one bad crop away, one disaster, and they're broke, right? So he very much resents the debt he owes to London merchants as he buys goods, because he has to keep up appearances. He's resentful of taxes that he has to pay to support the empire, right? And on top of that, he has speculated heavily in Western lands. Yes, like heavily in Western lands. And what that kind of means, to just cut to the chase here, is when the British Empire says, we do not want you, especially after the, I'm having a brain glitch, the French-Indian War. After that war, they draw that proclamation line and they tell the colonials, you cannot go west because they don't want any more fighting with the Native Americans. Washington, among many others, including Ben Franklin, they have speculated heavily in that Western land. If the British win, all that speculative land titles, they're making a bundle. If the French win, they just lose all that, right? So all of this sort of adds up to Washington joining into this is how he becomes a revolutionary. Now, what we want to think about here is, I'm not going to go through the arc of Washington's career as like a general and president and all those things. But one thing we want to think about here is, how do early Americans who are very self-consciously creating a republic, and I want to emphasize that because this is different, right? Because up to this point, in this context of British Empire and Europe and all that, they were used to governments organized as monarchy. Meaning what?
One king.
Yeah, you got a king. Yeah, we'll leave it at that, right? That's all, right? There's a king, there's a sovereign, right? And so when you start thinking about we're going to create a republic, that kind of complicates things for them because they're used to living in this world where the symbolism of nation was essentially the symbolism of the king, right? But if you're going to have a republic, you can't have a king. Does that make sense? So what they start doing, and early Americans, this early national period, they have this complicated relationship with this idea of how do we remember George Washington. It's not that they don't want to, or how do we remember the founders, or how do we celebrate. They do this. They want to have these things. Remember, this is how societies form cohesion, right? The stories we tell ourselves. But they also want to do it in a way that it doesn't look like monarchy. Does this make sense? And George Washington becomes probably the most preeminent symbol of what it means to be an American, right? More so than the US flag. Like today, we're used to living in a world where how often do we see the US flag? It's kind of everywhere, right? Yeah, they don't live in that world, right? So they start thinking, so Washington sort of fills that void. Washington's very self-conscious of this and really tries to model himself to be sort of this ideal Republican citizen, right? He thinks of that himself as virtuous, and we'll kind of get into some of these traits. But what this means is, even when he's alive, this process starts. So we have, actually, so I'll start with over here, the Wien story, the cherry tree story, right? What do you know about the cherry, Washington and the cherry tree? So what do you know about Washington and the cherry tree? He cut it down. Wow. We should never let that man be president. So we just needed to stop that right in there. All right, you know where that story comes from. Mason Weems. So we're living in a world where book culture is really coming on strong. Mason Weems basically is a book publisher, writer, blah, 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 right? And he writes this sort of, I think it's the first biography to come out about Washington after his death. And it's kind of like young adult stuff, right? It's aimed at kids. It's not meant for adults. It's not an adult biography. I think the first serious adult biography is written by John Marshall. I've never tried to read it, but the people who have read it said don't. So anyway, and what he does is he sets across this idea he's going to reveal George Washington's true character. Because George Washington's a stand-in for the country, and that's where the cherry tree thing. That doesn't happen. He makes the whole thing up. He just makes up stuff all the time. But it just enters into this social memory, this public memory, right? Washington doesn't lie, right? Also, we have over here the Society of Cincinnati. Do you want to tell the story? Or you want me to butcher it?
I can tell the story of Cincinnati.
Yeah.
So Cincinnatus is a man living in the Roman Republic. He is doing the good citizen farmer thing, plowing his field. A bunch of his fellow senators come to him and say, we have a crisis, so we're suspending the Constitution, which is something that's happened in Rome. We're suspending the Constitution and making you dictator to deal with the crisis. Dictatorship is a temporary position in Rome for a 6-month term. He deals with the crisis before the 6 months is up, willingly lays down the dictatorship, and then goes right back to his farm and picks up his plow and continues being a good citizen farmer.
I would have completely butchered that story. But anyhow, so the main point of that is Washington is aware of that story. Like in this period of US history, they're aware, people like Washington study the classics a lot, right? And the reason this is relevant is because, and we got some images coming around this, is that Washington gained prestige for giving up power, right? He steps down after he leaves the Revolutionary Army. He leaves the presidency after 2 terms. But early on, you have this society, and Washington gains this reputation as the American Cincinnatus, or American Cincinnati. So Cincinnati, Ohio, named after George Washington. So what this means is, though, is that there's a society formed, and this is where it takes a dark turn. You had all of the officers who served with Washington in the Continental Army. And this is where it becomes controversial. And this is one of the things we want to think about. And they formed this society. And they basically asked Washington if he'd be the honorary head of it. He says yes. So they do this. And then they make it hereditary. Now, what did they just step on in the Republican society? Yeah, they just stepped on democracy because aristocracy is hereditary, right? Like that is the thing. So this becomes very controversial because there comes this looming fear that they've created this hereditary society that's grounded in a standing army, another thing they don't like, that is going to seize power, right? So this actually becomes like a pretty big controversy around Washington. So, and then we have just a lot of imagery of Washington that come out of period of time. So this is what I was talking about, like not having the flags just like less. I don't say it's irrelevant, you just don't see it as much. But you start seeing like this image here. Here's Washington as the hub of the republic, like the 13 states are all around him. This one, you probably know, this was a famous one. This was a very stylized ritual. Washington goes into Congress and they purposely make a show because what is he doing here?
Resigning commission.
Yes, so talk to me about resigning his commission.
Pretty much he. After the war was fought, why he willingly gave up his role as general of the Continental Army, said, I've done my part, I'm gonna
Go back. I want to return to my farm and do farming stuff, which in his case is running a very large plantation, right? So he's not exactly like a humble farmer, but that's what he's going to do. But now, one thing we want to think about here is this. This is a big deal. So a couple things are kicking in here. One, he resigns his commission, right? What do generals who lead revolutionary armies more often than not do after the revolution? They take over, right? That's and there's like some things like maybe Washington should do that. It's not like the early republics going great, right? But Washington surrenders, so this is his prestige goes up. He's going to retire, right? But this becomes like a seminal moment for that sort of the legend of George Washington, right? This is another one that comes out kind of in that early period. So just take a minute and look at it. This is Washington praying at Valley Forge. I just like this one because like if you just think about what's the story of Valley Forge? What was it like there? What did they do? I believe what? They're in the middle of training the right. These are the times of trying to assault rivals, et cetera, et cetera. Look at this picture. What do you notice?
Operating season.
It is completely the season. Like they got him there, and then I don't know. So apparently they found a really robust stand of evergreens going on, right? So part of my point here is that these sort of imagery, right, is not always like this isn't grounded in a whole lot of historical accuracy, right? Like this, if I wasn't thinking of it this way, this would kind of drive me nuts. I'd be like where is the snow, and you know. And somewhere you can't see it very well, but somewhere back there is somebody like spying on Washington. And so kind of the image of this is Washington, and I'm not saying Washington, Washington was an advocate of religious tolerance to some extent. And there were critics of Washington who wanted him to be more overtly religious in his leadership. And so this is a way of saying like Washington was secretly that way. Right? This is a way of like, well, if you really look into the Washington, this is what you would see. But that scene doesn't work if he's standing out in the middle of a snowy field, you know, farm field or whatever, right? Oh, this one, I don't know, I just included this one because like you have to include this one. This one's what? Washington not practicing boat safety. That would have changed the revolution. Washington falls in, not wearing a personal flotation device. So Benedict Arnold becomes commander of the Continental Army. So That might be the beginning of a good Netflix series, I'll have to say that. Oh, come on, you know we did buy that one, right? So anyway, this one, crossing the Delaware River, I think it kind of speaks for itself. The symbolism, you got the rising sun of the nation. It basically is forming a halo around who? George Washington. This is Washington in a civilian garb. So we'll go over kind of to this one. Have you been to Wall Street? Seen this one, this is the original Capitol, like in New York City. So this is the statue that's there. And this one's significant because it goes back to the theme of Washington giving up power. Because what you have is Washington putting on his civilian garb, got a walking stick here, setting aside his military garb here, right? So it really is a symbolic, as he becomes president, this transition from military leader to civilian leader. So how does Washington's legacy get started? Because remember, they have a complicated relationship with this stuff. They want to have the sense of unity, the sense of nationhood, but they don't want it with monarchy. They don't want, so there's this sort of self-conscious, like, we're going to craft a Republican identity. But also, like, how do we think about George Washington? So, I mean, so actually, kind of one of the things is like, it becomes almost a trade in relics. Remember I said this kind of takes on a religious tone. So George Washington's hair, like literally his hair, if you have some of it, that becomes very valuable. Washington's hair, things they own, things like that. So they're not so much into like giant statues. They'll name things, but they're into that more like that. But you also have George Washington Curtis. This is Washington's grandson by Martha, and this is an important point. Washington does not have a son himself. He does not have a biological heir, which is extremely important. Why?
First practically see one line.
Yeah, like there's no George II, right? Like literally, like there's like that's how monarchs become around, right? Like, you know, your heir becomes the king. George Washington doesn't have one. Now he's got, depending on who you read, numerous surrogate children, sons at Hamilton and Lafayette running around. But he didn't have a biological heir. But Martha Washington had children from her first marriage that he basically kind of adopts and raises, right? So this is one of them, or one of his grandchildren. And so what he does is he kind of like takes on this role, reputational entrepreneur. He goes to George Washington's birthplace. He throws up a big kind of slab monolith thing and says, here George Washington was born. So he's in the vicinity. He's like in the right part of Virginia, so to speak, right? And he basically starts this like George Washington legacy thing. He gets, because he has Mount Vernon, he gets George Washington's uniforms and basically one person said he basically invents reenacting, historical reenacting. He has one of Washington's tents, like he used on the campaign. He'll bring you that out. But one of the things that's going on here is that, you know, do they actually know exactly where George Washington was born? The answer is no. And in fact, the cabin, the building, long gone. Like, you know, there's actually a huge controversy over trying to recreate it, and Congress had appropriated money, and they had like this fight over like what it looked like. And another one, like completely I wasn't going to go there. I think I mentioned this in class. Remember the thing about the Lincoln's birthplace in Kentucky? Anybody been there? No. So somewhere in Kentucky, there's a shrine. And remember, like we take pilgrimage to these historic shrines, so it's like that same theme again. And it's the log cabin Abraham Lincoln was born in, and it's sitting on top of this like stone. You have to walk up these stairs, and it's sitting on top of this stone thing. Now, Abraham Lincoln's born. Are they thinking we better hold on to this log cabin? No, they're not thinking, oh, this guy's going to be the 16th president of the United States, will lead the nation through the Civil War. No, that entire thing is fabricated. Much like what's going on here, it's not unlike the rock. If you go to Plymouth, Massachusetts, to get the rock where the Pilgrims stepped out on. And Steve, from getting closer to your zone, did he actually save that rock? Like the pilgrims were like, oh, this is a rock, this is the one, we better save it.
Well, you can go there.
I have been there and I laid eyes on it. And actually, just to make this even better, you know who dedicated that rock? Warren G. Harding. So, anyhow, no, that's like, I don't know, it's a nice rock, I suppose. It's symbolic. It makes us think about these things. But it's not the actual rock that, I don't know, whoever was the first pilgrim that got off the boat and stepped on North America. That's not that rock. So, so here what we see is that when Washington dies, we start to see these symbolic funerals all throughout the country. This one's at Philadelphia. This is the apotheosis of Washington. These are just kind of everywhere. So then we have a second one. I didn't include it, but there's also one of the apotheosis of Lincoln, where Lincoln is ascending and Washington is waiting for him. We also have Mount Vernon. Now, one point I want to make with this, because I haven't toured Mount Vernon in a long time, but Mount Vernon, like a lot of these, and this goes back to my point about the sort of way they thought about the founders, like Monticello's very similar fate, Madison's home out here, they all kind of almost fall apart, right? So Mount Vernon falls into serious disrepair. And there's various efforts to try to save it. And then finally, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association kind of take it, and from a museum sense, this is like a pioneering house museum effort, right? But they fundraise, they save it, and they turn Mount Vernon into Mount Vernon, the place we go today, and, you know, buy coffee mugs and whatnot. I don't want to go to Mount Vernon and buy coffee mugs. So anyhow. But what I want to point out here is this one of the tendencies that have happened this. So if we think about the 1920s, particularly the election of 1920, the country had just emerged through which war? World War I. How happy are Americans? Not that happy, right? I think when I teach that year, like 1919, I think it's 1919, but so I like my slide deck, I think it says worst year ever. Right, which I don't know if it's completely the worst year ever, but it's in the contention, right? It's in the discussion. So then we go to 1920, we start talking about the founding fathers, right? Now, the same way we're going to think about this. Let's think about this. 1858, they get Mount Vernon up and running. What's going on in the country?
Civil War, I mean,
We're on the cusp of the Civil War, right? So my point being here is that you see a lot of this activity. This is me going back to the beginning of all this when we talk about like how do we kind of like think about national unity, the story we tell ourselves, how do we create cohesion, right? And it's on the eve of the Civil War that we get Mount Vernon running, right? On the eve of the Civil War, we're like, wow, we need to think a lot about George Washington because he's the guy who brought us together before, and gets claimed by both sides. This is the seal of the Confederate States of America. So even as Abraham Lincoln goes to Gettysburg and evokes the Declaration of Independence and says 7 years ago our forefathers set forth on this continent, the Confederate States of America are saying, no, George Washington would be with us, right? And they kind of make that argument. George Washington was a slave owner, right? He, at the end of his life, does leave in his will that he frees the slaves that were his. It gets complicated because a lot of the slaves actually, the people who were enslaved are actually owned by Martha Washington's estate. But Washington, like at the end of the day, he kind of has this conflicted thing about slavery where depending on who he talks to, that's the side he seems to be on. So when he talks to Lafayette, who's an abolitionist, he's like, yeah, we need to figure out something to do about this. When he's talking to his fellow plantation owners, he's like, well, you know, we got to talk about it, you know. So he doesn't ever come out and he just kind of just assumes, like so many of the founders, that this issue will just go away. So by the time we get to the Civil War by 1861, the Virginians are claiming George Washington for their side, right? So we kind of see this kind of legacy thing working on both sides, both for unity and for disunity. Then we think about the Washington Monument, iconic. Right, and it just goes back to my point about monuments and their ambivalence about them, right? And I'm not saying you don't have any, but I'm just saying they're ambivalent about it. So here it is, late 1880s, they're finishing off the Washington Monument. I kind of got the punchline up here. They started the thing, ran out of money. Turned out Congress didn't want to appropriate enough money, so they just kind of like partway built it. That's why if you ever look very closely at it, there's like you can see the dividing line in it. There's like that's because they built part of it, ran out of money, and it sat for a while, and they came back and finished building it. But what I'm going to do is like, we always think about this like you're watching TV or a movie or something, you got that iconic view, Washington, and Lincoln in one end, Washington on the other, and the reflecting pond down the middle, and the whole thing just oozes nation, right? But it took a while to get there. Pointing out again, we're back to our Washington thing. What's the date here? So if I'm teaching the U.S. History Survey, I get to 1876. Am I saying, wow, is the Washington Monument year, or do I have something else I'm talking about? I got the end of Reconstruction, I got a disputed presidential election, I got the nation really seriously worried the Civil War is about to resume, right? So what do? You're like, wow, we better get this Washington Monument done. So, also Washington gets used by a bunch of other folks. I don't know if you've seen this one, and I want to be very clear here. I am not saying George Washington would have approved of this, but in 1939, there is a fascist rally in New York City. It's a really large one. There's a bunch of documentaries about this. But to prove their Americanness, whose picture did they put up? George Washington. Yeah. So now this is sort of close up. Like I felt like we needed a cleanser after that. so a palate cleanser after seeing the literal Nazis with the picture of George Washington. And I say that because like they wore swastikas, they were Nazis, but I'm not like calling them Nazis for no reason. So here we have this idea of like Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan. How did the Carter presidency go? Late 70s. We all get nostalgic for that period. Those of us who remember were like, yeah.
There's the energy crisis.
Massive energy crisis, stagflation. We all love stagflation. Yeah, so, but then you start to see this Washington thing appear again, right? Like, so that's kind of what I got. I got some recommended readings up here, because, history stuff. Any questions for me?
I have a question.
Yep.
Kind of not related, but related to, they brought up George Washington.
Yep.
In terms of, putting your name on US money.
Yep.
And the tradition is the person, well, I guess it doesn't have to be approved by Congress, it's just the Treasury, but it's usually not a existing president, but they said George Washington made it perfectly clear that we weren't gonna do that.
So a lot of, and I'm not a big expert on like money, like the actual history of money, like how the signing of money, the coinage of money. There is a kind of thought that like that's what monarchs do. They put their face on the coin. I guess I would also add that Washington, a lot of what we think about how the presidency functions, like if you go read the third article of the Constitution, it's actually pretty vague, right? There's going to be an executive will do some stuff. It's Washington who sets a lot of those parameters, right? And so I think that's probably would fall under that category. So like the idea that presidents, now it's enshrined in the Constitution, but the idea that the president steps down after 2 terms, that's Washington. The method of which they seek advice and consent from the Senate for treaties, that's Washington, right? So Yeah. Anything else? What?
I think I made something in the chat.
I'm sorry. Apologize for that.
So who won history?
I don't know, that's a weapon. Probably with Washington. So I think the point of,
History ends.
so that's what that's kind of my point is like, there's this whole social dimension to it. All right, well, in that case, I guess I'll wrap up. No other questions? Yeah.
I think the use of George Washington to kind of symbolize like freedom kind of transcends to like international levels, because as you know, like when Ho Chi Minh was trying to secede
Books
from
the
like,
Declaration of
country,
Independence.
he requested the Americans help and cited George Washington as like the revolutionary, as like somebody who is like the all-time god of revolution, right? And
Yeah.
so I think the use of George Washington is very symbolic, so I appreciate the chief explaining that.
And there's also this like sense of the revolution carrying kind of weight beyond it, right? Because when you start thinking about the founding fathers, especially when you get kind of more into like academic history, it's very easy to see the glaring contradictions in their lives. Top of the list, many of them were people who enslaved other people, right? And yet but kind of, I guess the way I end up thinking about it is like they don't own these ideas, right? These ideas are like in some way separate from them. So I think that they become kind of vehicles for talking about it.
There's a question from Chris.
Okay.
What's a good way for us to read or connect with Washington today?
I would actually just kind of read some biographies of it. I think that would do it. I don't know. I think that, and I think we should ask ourselves in terms of like our conduct as citizens. I think that's one of the legacies of the revolution, is that we're supposed to be citizens, not subjects. Like we're not subjects to a monarchy. We're citizens in a republic or a democracy, whatever you want to call us.
Question. I know nothing about a lot of this, but I'm curious about, Washington is so represented in his image and all that. The decision to have the Washington Monument be an obelisk and not something more like what we get with these civic temples later on.
As I understand this, they just kind of did that. Like that was just like a 19th century thing to do. Because you see the same thing when you're talking about his birthplace. And if you go into older cemeteries, you just see a lot of these. My understanding of how the Washington Monument is supposed to work is that each of the states, because the idea is Washington was such a towering figure that you really can't build a proper monument to him. So the idea would be that each of the states would contribute stone. So it's supposed to be like Georgia, what they got, marble in Georgia, I think, I'm not sure. Anyway, but each state would send some sort of, New Hampshire would send granite, right? And then they would use that to build the monument, and the monument would then sort of be made from the country he founded. And then when you went up into it and you looked out at the country, that would be how you would pay tribute to George Washington. Yeah.
Like I'm always thinking about, classical antecedents and references, like the obelisk, because it's something that Roman emperors love to import, but they're actually bringing them whole from different places around the empire.
Well, and also like get to the broader, and now I'm really getting outside of the zone, but you get into the broader sort of building of Washington, D.C., that it is in some ways like supposed to be like classical Roman Republic. And Washington, Jefferson, all these fellas love studying that stuff. Yeah.
Another question from New England. If you see a colonial house that's in a nice neighborhood, the people will say, George Washington slept there. So it's a common phrase that
Yep.
today called as a George Washington's left there. Do you know where that came from or?
I think it's just people all wanting to claim a little bit of history. Yeah, I don't know if we actually have a record of where George Washington slept, so, there might be somewhere, but if there is, I don't know about it. I think it's just like that tendency to wanna like, yeah, we're gonna claim a little bit of history. It's a little like when you see to a lesser extent, you know, everybody's sort of claiming, oh, my town was on the Underground Railroad, if you're in a certain part of the country, or, you know, bootleggers came through here. And there's enough truth to those things that, yeah, probably it might have happened, but it's also just sort of like a way of planting a historical flag to kind of create a sense of identity. So I don't want to say nobody, what they said about whatever house is true or not true. I'm saying I just don't know. All right, I'll start the wind down again so I can get another question. All right, I'm calling it. We're done. So, thank you.